right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Global Council for Innovative Organizations, GCIO. This is a monthly webinar that we run, inviting people from all over the world to participate. The GCIO is an organization that was founded with the objective of putting together the world's most innovative organizations that are driving innovation frameworks and innovation thinking in their respective regions, within their respective segments of the market. We have got members on the GCIO. The founders are Dubai Government Executive Excellence Program and the Global Innovation Management Institute. And then we got corporations as partners like Ayala. We've got universities like partners like La Salle in Barcelona. We've got partners like the Open Innovation Lab in Norway, who's a new member this particular week, who just joined us. We also have, of course, the government of the city of Bogota, which is trying to do innovation at small, medium-sized enterprises. Our objective is to democratize innovation and spread the message of how we can do things at scale in new and different ways and learn from each other and share best practices. We have a great speaker today who's going to teach us about innovation from a very different perspective in frontiers that have not been defined, in space that people don't know what the rules are. And in those places where there are no rules, the amount of innovation that happens is tremendous. But within some governance, within some rules, we can actually get disciplined and do more. So with that, I'm going to invite Grayson Bass to introduce our speaker. And we're looking forward to a great presentation today about innovation, space, and space governance, and what we can do, what we can't do, what we should do, and how can we apply it to the issues of our planet. Thank you. Grayson.
Oh, awesome, Hitendra. Hi, everybody. I think everyone's in for a treat. I met Timiebi about how long ago? Maybe 2 years ago, sometime during the middle of the pandemic. And we had connected over LinkedIn, which is an awesome tool. And I found her work and her as an individual to be absolutely fascinating. It's such an incredible thing to kind of think that we live in a time where we actually need people for space law. I just say it's just like piracy, but she's going to tell everyone why I'm wrong about that. So I hope that we can have her come on. I guess, are you there? Yep. And then let's get to the show, because you don't want to hear me speak when we have literally a global expert. So over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Can I get a thumbs up, Hitendra? Okay. So first of all, I should probably say that the Nigerian Space Agency spokesperson posted on LinkedIn this week officially that I am Nigeria's first female space lawyer. And I think the sad thing for me was that the first day I started my career, I already reached the peak, I guess, because he's like, yes, you are Nigerian space lawyer. And I'm like, what about the 15 years since then? But anyway, so let me share my screen and then we will get right to it. Okay, share screen. Okay, you can see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so governance innovation, lessons learned from the evolving case of space resources exploitation. I am a professor, an assistant professor at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University. Arizona State University, in case you don't know, in Arizona, has been named the #1 in the US for innovation. So this is what we're known for, the most innovative university in the country, above Stanford and MIT, and we're very proud of this. And Michael Crow, who's been the president for about 20 years, has this philosophy, the new American university. So ASU is basically shattered or tried to, shatter all, I don't know, whatever it is that a university is for, how a university is structured. If you want to see how they've tried to do it, then you need to get this book. Basically, I was trying to say, well, what does ASU think innovation means? And essentially, the only definitive definition I saw was this one from Michael Crow, that innovation is a product of creativity. But interestingly, I have worked in 2 organizations with innovation in the title. So the first one, the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Canada, and the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University in the USA. And I'm still at a loss for what innovation means. So, I mean, we can have a discussion about that and you guys tell me. But when I looked at these 2 organizations and I said, well, how are they officially defining innovation? What I really see that the Center for International Governance Innovation described itself at the intersection of technology and governance. So they're saying there's something about technology that's innovative. And my school, the School for the Future of Innovation in Society's mission or mantra is that the future is for everyone. So innovation there being kind of like mindset and thinking differently about how we structure that construct called the future. But the most innovative topic I can think of, which obviously connects these 2 places that I work at, is space law and governance, especially because I come from a developing country. I started my career at the Nigerian Space Agency. So certainly as an African space explorer, I would say the future is for everyone. And so Africa cares about space, developing countries care about space, and then governance, because without technology and science, we don't have space exploration. So I think space law and governance is the ultimate combination of these 2 things. But of course, it requires a few things off the bat. 1, checking your assumptions. First thing, know thyself, thy influences and thy conditioning. Embrace transdisciplinarity. There can be no silos in this game, as each lens approaches the problems of governance from a different perspective. And then there's a shift in priority because context matters. Equity, fairness, caring about stakeholders and those affected is the new game, because science and technology, absent of who are the people affected by this, doesn't change society, means that the future will not be for everyone. So that's kind of like the backdrop to talk about what I'm going to talk about today, which is basically, I don't know if you saw the abstract of this talk, philosophically, how space governance can help us think about more down-to-earth problems. So, the long and short of it is that my work is around polycentric governance at the national level and local level versus the need for strengthened central institutions at the global level. And so my theoretical approach is complex adaptive systems, right? Looking at space governance as a complex system that is adaptive, and how taking this systems approach helps us understand the innovations that happen in space governance by looking at the components collectively and questioning what new thing emerges by looking at governance as a whole instead of the silos of institutions or processes or laws per se. So that's what we're talking about today. So why the, what is the big hoo-ha about space all of a sudden? Obviously, space was huge in the 1960s. That was when people were talking about space law, and they had all these ideas about where space would be. But because of a bunch of innovations in off-the-shelf technology, miniaturization, and particularly reducing launch costs, over the past 10, 15 years, space has become a huge topic. This first headline about this metal-rich potato-shaped asteroid is actually a mission that ASU, my university, is leading to the first metallic asteroid that could be worth $10 quintillion. Sounds ridiculous, but we are going to that asteroid. It's a $1 billion mission to characterize the chemical composition of this asteroid. Look at the other bullet point. The space industry is on its way to reach $1 trillion in revenue by 2040. And in the news this week, you would have heard a lot about this launch that kept getting scrubbed. And it was important because it's the first mission to go back to the moon, but this time not going to the moon just to go plant a flag like Neil Armstrong did in 1969, but actually to go to the moon and establish permanent presence there. And then, seeing as I see that Dubai is important to this group, just a regional example. This year, the United Arab Emirates launched an $820 million fund to boost the domestic space economy. And this $5 billion loon colony is going to be one of the biggest tourism, ideas that is coming. So just even in one region alone, just to show you how much they went from nothing to basically investing close to $6 billion on space, or space-related activity. So now all these ideas that people are talking about with space are shadowed by uncertainty, because there are gaps and unclarity in space law, which mean that the subjects as well as the objects of space law are simply uncertain as to the legality or illegality of their proposed activities. So there's legal uncertainty about things like, you would have heard a lot in the news that there's a lot of space debris around the Earth, lots and lots of space junk running, rushing around the Earth. So we're talking about, now that we have the sustainability movement, how do we remove some of this junk? We're talking about things like satellite servicing. So it seems pretty ridiculous and unsustainable that you will spend $1 billion on a satellite, it goes into space, and then you can never see it again. So we're talking about satellite servicing. We're talking about manufacturing in space, right? We're talking about private citizens going up to space, not just astronauts. So there's a whole bunch of activities that people are thinking about, that there's a lot of legal uncertainty around those activities. The power of law, though, I'm a PhD in law, so of course I have a theoretical approach and a theoretical perspective. And the person that I started thinking about in my journey was a Harvard professor of critical legal studies called Duncan Kennedy. And his main thesis was the pretense that law is determinate or fixed mystifies social life and stifles the emancipatory potential of the law. Therefore, the status quo remains. But if there is one thing to take away from this talk, especially from a social justice perspective, is this quote from Duncan Kennedy that I love so much. He said, "Once I believed the materials and the procedure produced the outcome, but now I experience the procedure as something I do to the materials to produce the outcome I want." So that is to say that people use law either as a shield or as a sword, right? And Duncan Kennedy talks about social transformation. So he's trying to tell people, you can use don't think that the law is fixed. It's something that you experience and you do to it to produce an outcome that you want. So, as someone from a marginalized society, or as a woman or whatever, I take this to mean, oh, we can challenge the status quo. But it is interesting. Duncan Kennedy teaches at Harvard. So of course, the Harvard students, who are the ones who are running the world, are also learning these techniques. So the question is, who will do this legal work of transformation? I don't teach law students, so my students are rarely lawyers. And I tell them that legal work is the transformation of initial apprehension, like that is a hunch, of what the legal materials making up the system require by an actor who is pursuing a goal or vision of what they should require. So legal work, you don't have to be a lawyer. You just have to have a hunch about what legal materials require, and you have to have a goal and a vision of what they should require. And of course, people like Duncan Kennedy give us the techniques through his writing. So A critique of adjudication looks at the role of politics and legal reasoning. Freedom and constraint of adjudication deals with what it's like to be a judge, and the semiotics of legal argument discusses legal argumentation. So that's the first thing I say to my students. Don't be scared by the fact that lawyers say that they hold this title to legality. But what is the uniqueness of the space of international lawmaking from a space context? Well, it's like a laboratory to think about general international law, because space law is today's most dynamic area of law. Like climate change law, which is what I did my postdoctorate in, we will be lucky that those who were there in the beginning of space law may still be alive to see its evolution. Many areas of international law are not like that. They were established in like the 1600s. Space law is the newest baby in town. And the space law case study shows how private actors can force the development of uncodified international law on two levels, right? On the doctrinal level, right? Private conduct can be attributed to the state, and private behavior itself becomes state practice that can inform the meaning of a treaty or the development of customary international law. And this is important because obviously private actors are not an actor of international law. International law is about states. And secondly, on a realpolitik level, these private actors can nudge the law towards their preferred interpretations by simply acting as though their preferred rules were already law. Right? And this is interesting because this puts the states in a reactive posture, actually increasing the likelihood that the chosen rules of the private actors will prevail. And therefore, any new regulations that take a position on the meaning of international space law from the state's perspective do so with heightened stakes, because those regulations will either facilitate or quash the intentions of an array of heightened businesses. So space law is just a fascinating window because it's very clear and dynamic to see it happening and thinking about how it applies in other contexts. So everyone, you'll see all the time, space is the wild, wild west. There are no laws. In fact, this was an interview with me, and I can't even believe this was an interview with me, and this is the title. So people misinterpret all the time and think space is lawless. But in the context of what I want to explain today, that space is not lawless, and the issue is about interpretation of existing laws, I want us to remember Duncan Kennedy's thesis that the main barrier to social transformation is the fetishization of the law that society has, and that destabilizing work needs to be done. And according to Kennedy, as I define legal work, it corresponds to the preferences of the interpretive worker. And when performing legal work, the worker strategically pursues a goal, and it is the combination of time, strategy, skill, and the attributes of the rule that you're trying to change as those appear in the context of the facts presented that will determine how successful one will be to achieve his goal, whether that outcome seems self-evident or not. So that is the context to talk about space law. So let me give you an example of how we think about this. The word national appropriation is the biggest issue right now. So the Outer Space Treaty, the OST, is the international law that applies to space. And the problem is the provisions of the Outer Space Treaty for some activities are quite general, leaving room for different states to interpret them differently, to develop national rules that differ from those of other states, or enforce those rules with differing degrees of rigor and consistency. A full and systematic treaty interpretation, which is a legal activity carried out in accordance with Article 31 and 32 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, actually supports the view that the Outer Space Treaty does not address and was not intended to address the issue of property rights over extracted space resources. Remember, I told you guys, for instance, that Arizona State University is leading that mission to that asteroid that could be worth $10 trillion. Now, who owns that? Can you have property rights? Property rights mean ownership rights over that $10 trillion worth of resources. It's a legal question. Where does it speak to that in the Outer Space Treaty? Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty states that outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of occupation, or by any other means. Problem: there is no ordinary meaning for the word national appropriation, since the term is not used anywhere else in international law or in day-to-day conversation. So we don't know whether it means title to territory or simply the use of an object or an area by one state to the exclusion of others. As a result, this first stage of interpretation, so under the Vienna Convention of the Law of Treaties, the first step of interpretation is to look at the ordinary meaning of the terms, does not take us very far. The next step is to look at the context. The context is basically that a decade after these rules were drafted, there was a moon agreement that was negotiated. And essentially, this was in the context of the decolonization movement, developing countries wanting, things to be resources for everyone. And what was agreed was that a negotiating conference will be called later to establish a governing regime for space resources. This was in 1979. That never happened. The deferral suggests then not the existence of any agreement regarding the interpretation of the treaty, but rather an absence thereof. But what happened in 2015 was revolutionary. There's a Space Resources Exploration and Utilization Act of 2015 by the United States that in section 402 states that United States citizens engaged in commercial recovery of an asteroid resource or a space resource shall be entitled to any asteroid resource or space resource obtained, including to possess, own, transport, use, and sell the asteroid resource obtained in accordance with applicable law, including the international obligations for the United States. And at Harvard Business School, if you search this, you'll find this case study that they have about a company called Planetary Resources, who basically took it upon themselves to help get that section brought into law. And I've got a little quote there where their legal advisors said, "We looked at the whole gamut of options, weighing things from modifying the Outer Space Treaty to an executive order to creating new legislation to doing nothing and allowing a space law to prove itself. And you can immediately take some things off the table. Modifying the existing treaty has major challenges. On the other extreme of doing nothing, we believed that was just maintaining status quo, and we were trying to do more than the status quo to improve investor confidence. They want to know that if they invest, we will return a profit." So this team basically went through this whole process that you can read in that Harvard Business School case to get this law into action. But the next step, that's national law. This is an international law issue. Is it okay for America to just make a national law that says Americans can own any resource when international law is not clear? If we go back to the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, America may want to rely on Article 31(3)(b) that says any subsequent practice in the application of the treaty which establishes the agreement of the parties regarding its interpretation should be taken into account. So many would argue that because America set up something called the Artemis Accords, which has 20 signatories, that this is subsequent practice by states and constitutes objective evidence of the understanding of the parties as to the meaning of the treaty. So the Artemis Accords is a series of bilateral executive political agreements between the United States and other countries that want to cooperate on this Artemis program. So this Artemis program, of which that launch happened last week, is the mission to go back to the moon and stay on the moon. So the memorandums of understanding have been signed by 21 states as of July, Australia, Bahrain, Brazil, and including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And it sets a normative framework based on the Outer Space Treaty that covers all kinds of activities involved with lunar exploration. So the provision in reference to space resources is worth illuminating, particularly section 10.2, that says the signatories emphasize that the extraction and utilization of space resources, including any recovery from the surface or subsurface of the moon, Mars, comets, or asteroids, should be executed in a manner that complies with the Outer Space Treaty and in support of safe and sustainable space activities. The signatories affirm that the extraction of space resources does not inherently constitute national appropriation under Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, and that contracts and other legal instruments relating to space resources should be consistent with that treaty. Why is this interesting? I know for a fact, well, I don't know for a fact, there's no way that America would have initially proposed that inclusion of the word inherently in that phrase. That is to say, the US probably said, the signatories affirm that the extraction of space resources does not constitute national appropriation under Article 2. But because this is a negotiated agreement, and all those other countries would have been like, are you sure you can say that? They added the word inherently, which again adds uncertainty, because what does it mean that resources do not inherently constitute national appropriation? That is very different from resources do not constitute national appropriation. And then the fact that they also came back to the Outer Space Treaty and said it must be consistent means that the whole provision is circular, which still adds to uncertainty. So I don't think that this can completely amount to subsequent agreement. And as some important states, including Germany and India, have hesitated becoming signatories to the Artemis Accords, and China and Russia are leveraging this hesitancy, right, to do their own thing, would challenge future legal structures endorsed and based on the Artemis Accords. And there is currently a working group on space resources at the United Nations Committee on Space with a 5-year agenda. And China and the G77 led the call for the Space Resources Working Group. So is this evidence that there is no subsequent agreement despite the practice? So what is the latest innovation from America with respect to this issue of clarifying ownership rights in space? This is fascinating. It comes from NASA in contracting and public-private partnerships, where they are basically trying to norm set through private sector activities for the purchase of lunar soil with the explicit goal of creating legally relevant subsequent practice. So in September 2020, NASA announced it would buy lunar soil from commercial landers as a token purchase intended to set a precedent. So local and international companies that would be selected for these space resources contract would collect a small amount of lunar soil from any location on the moon and then provide imagery to NASA of this collected material along with the data that it identifies the collection location. And then after NASA receives the information, the company would have conducted an in-place transfer of ownership of the lunar regolith to the agency, completing the commercial transaction. 80% of the payment is to be made on delivery. Now, the payment is only a nominal amount. The transfer of ownership and the act of selling something collected on the moon is the innovation here, because this sets a precedent that an in-orbit transaction does not amount to appropriation. And then after this ownership transfer, the collected material becomes the sole property of NASA for the agency's use. So in December, NASA announced the companies that selected to collect these lunar resources. 21 proposals were received and 4 bids won. One from Colorado, one from Japan, one from Europe, and another one from California. And these contract awards ranged from $1 to $15,000. Funding is so low because NASA is paying solely for the material without footing the bill for any of the company's development costs. Now, while the countries that these companies were registered in have all signed the Artemis Accords, it begs the question, if they had not been nationals of these signatories countries, how would such action have bound their countries? After all, Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty says that state parties shall bear international responsibility for the national activities in outer space, including activities by non-state actors. This contracting approach also raises a number of significant governance questions. What, for me, the biggest one is that third bullet point. What are the competition law implications of a 10-cent contract? So you see this headline, NASA administrator presented Justin Cyrus, CEO of Colorado-based startup, with the first payment ever issued to a company for 10 cents. How on earth are African countries supposed to compete, considering that a 10-cent contract is being used as international legal precedent about who has rights to something like $10 trillion worth of resources? So they're doing what Duncan Kennedy said about the innovative legal worker. Duncan Kennedy is the person that I studied. And when I talk about social justice and social transformation, I say, look at Kennedy. You experience the materials to get the outcome that you want. But is this allowed, what they're doing with space resources? Is all this fair? Does all this lead to better, equitable, and inclusive futures? And this is why we always must question innovation, because it's a buzzword that doesn't necessarily mean better. So when we take what Kennedy said, we have to note that he said, however, a clear understanding of the nature of destabilizing work is vital, as well as an understanding of the characteristics of those who will carry out this work. So I think this is my last slide. Lex lata is what the law is, and lex ferenda is what the law should be. What are my 3 priorities? The first step, of course, is to get everyone on the same page about the lex lata, what the law is. But when we think about lex ferenda, we need 3 things. The first thing, we need an international position on many outstanding issues. These established countries like this idea of no regulation because it means that they can do whatever they want. The whole pirates thing that Grayson was talking about. But no regulation leads to overexploitation. They love to use the example, spaces like the high seas. No one owns the fish in there. You own the fish that you collect. But because of overexploitation, high seas fisheries are subject to international regulation, actually. You have the 1995 United Nations Agreement on straddling fish stocks. You have regional treaties such as the 2018 International Agreement to prevent unregulated high seas fisheries. And you have numerous regional fisheries management organizations. And these treaties often result in science-based quotas and sometimes moratoria. And other areas beyond national jurisdiction, such as the deep seabed and Antarctica, are also governed through specific multilateral agreements. These regimes are not perfect, but they exist. And many states cooperated in their creation. So why is space different? The second point is to recognize that space governance is a complex adaptive system. We have to understand that the interrelations of the instruments, legal or non-legal, the institutions and the processes are part of a system that is centered by the mindset and relations between stakeholders, that is on the one hand marked by complexity and on the other hand, adaptive. As space law continues to evolve, it will be necessary to analyze the relationship between legal standards and norms, coupled with the technical understanding of the capabilities, hardware, software, and astrophysics applicable to the space domain. And that third bullet point there, who are the actual actors and stakeholders that matter? My third point, for some reason, the capitalists out there are completely against benefit sharing. And I think that any kind of international governance regime must have a benefit sharing arrangement in exchange for exploitation rights. So that is to say, because space is supposed to be used for the benefit and interest of all countries, we have to figure out a way how all countries and all peoples will benefit, which is a very challenging and difficult task. There's a whole bunch of things that I suggest about how we think about this. First of all, recognize what your problem is. Do the objective research that determines, do you need an instrument to address this problem, a specific instrument? Find the norm entrepreneurs, or ask if the norms have crystallized. So this is a Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties exercise. You make the rule or you interpret the rule, recognizing cognitive dissonance applies, because people filter out what doesn't fit their worldview. If you think that space exploration is manifest destiny, like many people feel, Westerners, or if you feel that we are set to colonize, it's a very different attitude than the indigenous perspective of our relationship to the stars. You need incentives to influence people to make change. How do you amend or apply these rules? How do you enforce the rules, whether through social, moral, or other mechanisms? What kind of institutions have to be designed to be able to do this, and are they adaptive? How do you use feedback loops to determine whether the right things are happening? And then how do you ask whether the governance process decreases or actually solves the problem?
That was fantastic.
I don't know if that was 30 minutes, but yes, we can discuss.
Yeah. First of all, Professor, that was a great conversation and insights on how do you define the rules in an environment that is not defined? How do we avoid greed taking over? And greed is a big piece of this, saying, the winners take it all if they are big and they get stronger. Colonialism is a different mindset. You use that word to describe a free for all. And then there are things about the definition of innovation. And then if we do things wrong, how do we do that? So I just wanted to, first of all, emphasize the following. When we talk about innovation, we also emphasize the guidance. In order to innovate, you need to know which rules to follow. You need to know which rules to actually break. And you also need to know which rules to make. And that's the judgment that allows us to do new and better things on one side. On the other side, the outcome of innovation is supposed to be value for everybody. And on that definition of value, it has changed over time. Value used to be money. Value used to be collection of gold or other things. But value has gone to things which are sustainable value, which is more around society, people, environment, and other included statements on the word value. And so we are maturing on our definition, but again, in an environment where winners can take it all, in new environments and new playing grounds, the winners can be greedy, and the winners can define their own laws with better lawyers and stronger lawyers to say this is the way to do things in the right way or wrong way. So fascinating, it's provoking a lot of thinking for us in terms of what we are doing. The question I have is, there is a analogy of the Wild West in here for people saying, we make our own rules and we carry our own guns if we have to make sure we'll enforce those laws. What are the rules that will allow us to collaborate? Because what we are trying to do in our GCIO meeting over here is to say that we need to collaborate. So Are there joint projects that we can work on? Are there joint activities that we can do that builds trust, that builds a collaboration, that builds hope, that we can do this kind of things? What are the types of projects that you see that we can start now that can create the end game, saying value for all, and stakeholders from the beginning to work on those projects, that in that way we can actually come up with better governance ultimately? So
Yes.
it's a big question. What are the big projects that we can work on together, and how we can take this group of people and say, let's work on something that gets us started?
Yeah. So the number one thing for me is we need to open up this concept of space away from the space geeks and the science fiction fans, because it's great, right? It's great. You'll hear people saying, I watched Star Trek since I was 2 years old. It's because of those people that the US kind of spent billions of dollars on this laser Star Wars mission that they wanted to use to protect space, right? They spent billions because all those people grew up watching Star Trek, and, so now we're at the point where it's, someone like me, an African, I don't go to the conversation and I'm like, how cool would it be to live on Mars? I'm like, how do I make sure that Africans benefit from whatever future is coming, right? The only way that, and an African is never going to hear about $1 trillion worth of space resources because they watch Star Trek. You know what I mean? It's because of serious conversations like this where I say, guess what? One university in America just spent $1 billion to fight to get that mission to go to the asteroid. You got to put real money behind things, and you have to not see things like this as, oh, that's just for those people. That's just for the science fiction fans. This is real business. This is, by 2040, this space economy is going to be worth $1 trillion, right? So the first thing is mainstreaming this concept that space isn't just fun, or like it's people are putting serious money behind an in-space economy. And there's already a space economy in that everybody already knows about GPS, right? Like everybody already knows that we have satellites that monitor our borders. Everybody already knows that we get internet access. If you use your ATM machines, the time stamping so that you can do transactions is all done from space. So most people already know that space is part of our everyday life. What they don't know is at least 20 countries are going to the moon to stay.
Yep.
So there's going to be infrastructure built up there. The number one thing that everyone is looking for is water, because if you find water, we have hydrogen for fuel, so we don't have to carry our own fuel to space, and we have oxygen to breathe, so we don't have to carry oxygen from Earth. Right? So the first thing is just getting the word out there that that's the future economy. And then the second thing is getting people to think of, well, how does my regular business apply in this new context?
Very good. I want to open up the floor to questions for the GCIO members. There's Vince from Ayala, and folks from the DGP, and folks from Jimmy also. So first, if there's any questions that you'd like to put your hand up, so I know you have a question to ask on this thing. While we wait for questions to pop up so we can see them, we're going to make sure that they'll ask the question, not on the chat, but they'll ask the questions. In the space thing, just to make sure everybody on this audience is very space excited, and they know a lot about space, and they know a lot about the science and technology. The challenges, they watched the movie about Mars and living on Mars for even 2 days or 3 days, making that possible. We have done challenges of how to grow food on the moon or on Mars. So we've done all kinds of extraordinary things as a group, and we use them because those hostile environments allows us to find low-cost ways of doing things here on Earth. Low-cost, different ways to grow things in the deserts or in the water or in some sort of hostile environment. So we use space as a trigger, saying, what if you didn't have enough oxygen? What if you didn't have enough water? And those kind of things. And so we do use those as trigger points for thinking. And we also use them deliberately to advance our own science and technology. I was at Motorola, and we deliberately used the Iridium technology platform. We said we wanted to do it, put satellites around the world to accelerate gallium arsenide semiconductors, communication devices, battery technology that has not existed. So we use space as a means to pull technology forward because it's such a hostile environment, such a difficult environment. And so it's been really fantastic on that. Do you see also, and Arizona is right there where all the satellites were launched by Motorola, right there in Scottsdale, Arizona is where we did that. Do you see those collaborations from industry and space to say, do the collaboration, use that as a way to provoke and pull new food sciences, new battery technologies, new other things as another way to educate and yet at the same time create new rules?
Yes, I mean, it's challenging, and I'll tell you where the challenge, I experienced this challenge. So I worked as a consultant in Canada, and one of my tasks, I was in charge of, the Canadian Space Agency was my client for their commercialization work. So trying to market Canadian Space Agency technology to businesses outside of space. So that was my job. And, you know, so it involved me getting on the phone and first of all, trying to figure out how can this technology translate, right? And then how do you even approach people to say, can you imagine using this in your business? These conversations don't happen very often, right? Because space and non-space are in these silos, right? So what I ended up doing, and one of the beautiful things about, I was doing my PhD at the time, so I was connected to McGill University, was any of these new technologies that came out, I would try and find someone that was doing a PhD in like something similar and be like, can you help me design an experiment so that we can see how this Canadian Space Agency technology may apply in a different context? And so that was how I did the work. I would create these marketing materials, and then I would create these experiments that these companies could get into partnership with the Canadian Space Agency to test how can there be a symbiotic. But look at how much work that took. That took the Canadian Space Agency hiring us to do the translation work, because a lot of people can't do this translation of space and non-space. That's like, there's like a huge innovation gap there in like translating how these things apply to each other.
Oh, very good. Great points. Vince, you had a question. Vince is one of our GCIO partners from Ayala in the Philippines.
Hi, good day, everyone. Professor Timiebi, very good to see you again. I loved your TED Talk. It's not so much a question. I just wanted to say that I'm very fascinated. The closest to space that my work's been is retail space, office space. We are in a conglomerate of real estate and financial services and energy and water, after all. So it's very much ground-bound, earth-bound that we're looking at. But where I'm really fascinated in is because you're pushing frontiers. You're looking at the unknown, looking at new sources of value, looking at new ways of sharing how to capture that value with other countries and using law and negotiation. I mean, that's what we're looking at when we look at fintech, for example, in the Philippines. I myself am from a developing economy too, where we deal with policymakers evolving what can be done, managing risk, and looking at opportunity that new technology or new business models open up. So in my more mundane applications of what I'm learning from you, that's where it is. It's really, how do we find new value? How do we share that value across? I'm learning a lot, and I'm very fascinated. Right, it's a very good analog to the different things we're looking at. That said, it's also looking at frontiers, whether it's nanotechnology or blockchain or going deep into the sea looking for new sources of energy. I mean, we're a little bit into some of those things. I'm fascinated, and I will continue to watch the development of your work.
I think
You know,
really-
you know what's interesting? Why we need real estate people in this conversation about property rights in space? Even though, because this is a really complex topic to think through, because even though that you can't own territory in space, like clearly, how are people going to be able to do anything if they don't have any kind of property right? Right? How can you have a space mine if you can't figure out like how you protect that as yours? So we have to innovate around property rights. And we have to remember, this is always going to be a debate, because if you look back to what everyone says, when I look through LinkedIn and all the people that have made a ton of money and are really rich, it always come back to the fact that they say, you need real estate, right? Like for some reason, our society, since we became stationary people, it's all about having my little piece of land. That is it. So it's a complex thing, because in space law purposely had to say, we know that the root of all violence is people protecting this little piece of land. So let's avoid ownership in space. But all these countries are like, we want to live and work in space. We want a whole economy in space without property rights.
So that's a great point. So property rights is going to be a big opportunity discussion, and whoever is able to define those things are going to win. I just want to share something as a provocation. Every single major corporation in the world tries to establish standards. And the standards are usually established by those that it will favor them. Bluetooth is a standard. Microsoft as a software platform, PowerPoint is a standard. And that standard now gives Microsoft a competitive advantage, so that they are the only player in the game. So standards have been used by governments and standard railway lines and the width of the railway tracks. That gave competitive advantage to whoever made the trains, because they had to fit on the tracks. So standards is a way to continue sustaining your own power and your own growth and everything else. And so I don't see us really deviating from those who go there first to set the standards that will allow them to continue winning in the future.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just a natural thing of how this thing plays out. So how do you collaboratively create standards such like the UN, which doesn't feel too socialist, where the belief is too much socialism or goes to communism, versus something which is capitalistic, which keeps the entrepreneurial energy and the desire to grow simultaneously? Because those are two forces in play that you are trying to say we must do good, we must make profit, but do good at the same time.
Yes, that's a fantastic question, because the interesting thing is, because I'm an equity, diversity, and inclusion person that came from a developing country, people always think that my work is around saying, look how unfair the system is, look how bad America is. People don't realize I work with people like Rwanda, who spent $1 billion on the OneWeb constellation. Rwanda have $300,000 worth of, 300,000 licenses for satellite frequencies at the International Telecommunications Union. I work with African countries to say, look, this is the system. You've got to learn it. You've got to be part of this. You've got to figure out where can you play in the game. You don't need to be technologically savvy and have a launch vehicle to have 300,000 licenses for satellite frequencies, for instance. You don't need to, have the #1 rocket propulsion technology. Like, there are things that you can do, even if you look like you're not part of the game. You don't, like what I say to them, look what I've been able to do, be a voice in the space law thing. You don't need to be Rwanda, Angola, Botswana can define the property rights regime of the moon without being technologically advanced. So that's what I say. It's like, how do you see your strength and capitalize on that? Because it's better to just have a little small piece of the game rather than to say, oh, I'm not SpaceX, so I can't do anything.
Very good. We've got Ron who's got a question, and he has got his part of a legacy which actually started the whole journey of space. So Ron, you have the floor, and let's listen to your question.
Okay, so thank you, Atendra. Yeah, the legacy is my father was head of all the propulsion systems for NASA for about 25 years. And we had daily or weekly conversations about how to assure that Teflon or whatever it is that came out of the space program was available to everybody internationally. And I think one of the interesting things that I'd like to throw out there is one of the things that space is it's a laboratory. And so right now, a lot of the stuff that's going up into space has everybody collaborating on various experiments or modules to discover things, how things work, discover new materials or whatever. And I think that's a way that if you can assure that that's open, that's a laboratory that's open to everybody to participate in one way or another, whether it's universities or governments or companies. I think that's an important thing to put out there so that so the accessibility is there. So my first question is, how do we assure open accessibility? And my second one is in terms of rights. It seems to me there's a lot of, except for extraction rights, in terms of there's a lot that goes on with patent law and copyright law and everything else that applies here to assure that the value creation and value capture are balanced in a way that people take risks to invest in these things. So I think there should be some precedent in that to assure that we continue to encourage entrepreneurship rather than shutting it down. I think extraction is the one that I still kind of worry about how we do that in the moon or Mars or anything else. But it seems to me the one I'd like to see us open up more is the whole laboratory, not just laboratory, physical laboratory, but the whole laboratory of space, whether it's the surface of the moon or Mars or any place else. So I'd like your kind of comments on how, again, hearkening back to what Atendra said, what do we do now rather than throw up our hands and say, there's no legal framework for doing this? How do we provide enough assurance to both individual small companies, small countries, and everything else, as well as to larger investors to move forward rapidly? Because I think the last thing we want to do is slow the pace of exploration and discovery.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Boundary organizations like Arizona State University are doing remarkable things. I don't know if you guys have heard of Orbital Reef. Orbital Reef is the first commercial space station, and it's being launched by Amazon's company, Blue Origin, and Arizona State University, a group of 14 universities that are doing all the stuff around ethics, governance of this new commercial private space station. One, ASU developed a program that is basically in partnership with Lockheed Martin, where people will collectively work on a mission. So it's a subscription model.
Yeah.
Right? So geared at developing countries. My problem with that was I was like, if I was a developing country, I'm not sure I would join, because I'm not sure I want Lockheed Martin to be to be like the head of this. But you know, the idea.
But who do you want to be the head of it? If it's not somebody with deep pockets, who is it?
Yeah. I don't know, but I wouldn't sign up to something that was run by Lockheed Martin as a developing country. So it's got to be someone else. So, you know, it's at ASU, we have the Interplanetary Initiative, which is a university-wide space project that says all space projects, all space activities done in silos. We need a university program where every aspect of the university is involved in thinking about what does an inclusive space future look like? Right, so that's where all my work, most of my work has been funded from. This is where the person who is leading this is a vice president of the university. And the president of the university is the co-chair. So this is very high level, right? That they're running this university-wide space mission. So it's like new, and ASU's mission, I don't know if you've heard about our charter, but it's all about inclusivity. It's all about like, how do we make sure that, like my school, the future is for everyone? By being the people that create these infrastructures and are these boundary organizations that can bring everyone together. So what I said at the beginning, transdisciplinarity is going to be key, right? Because people work at engineers saying, I want to build this. Scientists saying, I want to do this experiment on their own doesn't get us to where we're trying to get to. It's a whole bunch of people sitting together in a room, concurrent. I think when I was at the International Space University, I learned about concurrent design facilities, whereby you have like a whole bunch of different engineers in one room. Everyone is on a different computer that is all linked together. And each one of them is working on their component of the satellite at the same time. So that was and it was like, this facility was like revolutionary, because usually the electrical engineers are on their own and the mechanical engineers on their own. And here, this concurrent design facility, everyone is designing the spacecraft at the same time. Well, we need a concurrent design facility that is not just for engineers, that is actually, because, for instance, I'm on the science advisory board of the SETI Institute, which is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, Worldview Enterprises, which is a stratospheric balloon company that is taking people to space. And I'm a lawyer, right? They kind of realize that we're not going to have space tourism if we don't have somebody that does talk about, well, who is even able to imagine and think that they can spend this money to go to space?
I'm going to interrupt. We are approaching the end of our webinar. Great questions and great answers. We're going to wrap this up. Ron, thank you for your question embedded in here. Let me just leave some words of advice for our community who's listening. First and foremost, space is here, and space rules are being established. And if you're not on a seat, you're not at the table, you're going to miss out on it. So you better get yourself on a table to make sure that your voice has been heard. You want to be included on those decisions, those discussions, and that's what I heard was being said. Very important, number one. And we will make rules and we will create laws, and they will be in the advantage of those who are at the table. So be at the table, number one, okay? Number two is, as this thing evolves, for many of us, it feels very far away, but it doesn't need to be far away. You can use space as a trigger. When I was at Motorola in the 80s and 90s, we used space to create all our technology of cell phones, satellite communication, and we accelerated things. When we were working with food companies have said, can we produce food in environments like Mars and other places to show we can use less water, less energy, less everything. So we can use space as a way to pull things forward and experiment and create new things cheaper, better, faster. So we got to do that. Because these challenges are much more difficult, we have to be inclusive, we got to have partners, and we got to work together. And that's our big idea over here on innovation, is how can we do bigger and bolder things faster and cheaper, and it's through collaboration across the globe. What we aren't talking about enough times, and I think I appreciate this, Professor, is the inclusivity conversation of the smaller players or the bigger players or the regions that have been left behind before for various reasons. How do we think more inclusive? Because this is another chance. We have another chance to do things in the right way. The last experiment wasn't the best experiment, right? So we got another chance to do it right. So with that, I just want to leave those words with everybody. We're going to wrap it up. I'll give you 30 seconds, your appeal, whatever your appeal is, Professor, and then we'll say thank you to everybody and wrap it up. So you got 30 seconds to say whatever you want to say.
Okay. My favorite quote is from Joey Esrich and Ed Finn, who said, "Space is not a void, but a canvas for the human imagination. Questions of policy and logistics are merely scaffolding for a deeper set of questions about who we are and who we want to become as a species. We explore the universe not just because we are curious, but about what that curiosity will do to us and how we will grow to match our expanding sphere of understanding.
That was great.
Great
Thank
ending.
you. That was bravo. Well done. Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. We are recording this thing. It'll be available to the audience to see it at some later time. If they wish, go to the website for Global Innovation Management Institute. It will also be on the GCIO website. Thank you very much. Our next presentation will be 1 month from now, and we'll send an announcement who our next speaker is. Thank you. Have a great rest of the week. As our philosophy says, we have to innovate. We've got to do bigger and bolder things. And the only way to do it is together we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.